Loss of signal, Meridian, the comms officer barked, fingers tearing across his interface. Elena Voss was already moving toward the tactical display when the icon blinked from green to nothing. No static, no telemetry spike, no warning of any kind. 1 second the ship was there. The next it simply wasn't, and her sister's youngest, 23 years old, 3 months into her first deployment, was on that ship. Maya. Voss felt the name rise and killed it where it stood. There would be time to feel something later, or there wouldn't. Either way, it had no business on this bridge right now. Ocular feed, left flank, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. The screen blinked. Where the Meridian had been a heartbeat prior, there was only a jagged, expanding ring of shredded insulation and flash-frozen alloy shards, glinting dully in the dark. No heat signature, no structural integrity alarms. The ship hadn't just been destroyed, its forward section had been sheared cleanly away from the universe. Range, 78,000 kilometers in closing. Tactical Officer Marcus Webb's voice climbed an octave he probably didn't notice. No active radar, no LiDAR, no thermal bloom. It's not behaving like a ship, Commander. The wrongness of it hit Voss the moment she looked at the main feed. This wasn't a stealth coating built to swallow radar. The hull surface didn't reflect or refract starlight so much as fold around it, bending the stars behind it into long, wrong arcs that made her eyes ache to track. No visible seams, no apparent propulsion, nothing her mind could find a comfortable name for. "Keep the railguns spun up," she said. "Don't let the capacitors bleed off." A slow ripple traveled the alien hull, bow to stern. An instant later, the Taro's icon vanished exactly as the Meridian's had. "Impact!" Webb shouted, then caught himself. "No, wait, no kinetic reading, just an energy spike, terawatt range, then nothing. She's gone, Commander." 2 ships. Voss had read both crew manifests 3 days earlier, memorizing names the way she'd been trained to. A commander who knew her people's names made better decisions than one who didn't. That was the theory anyway. Knowing those names had done nothing at all to save them. She wondered distantly whether anyone aboard the Meridian had known they were dying, or whether it had simply been a thought mid-sentence and then nothing. She hoped it was the second one. She hoped it for Maya especially, and hated herself a little for needing to. "Target the center mass," she said. "All batteries, fire on my mark. Linked salvos, fire." The Resolute bucked beneath her boots as the railguns cracked, magnetic coils hurling 500-pound tungsten slugs into the dark at 70 kilometers a second, the violence of it bone-deep and rhythmic. On the display, a shimmer bloomed around the alien hull. It contracted tighter wherever a slug struck home, swallowing each impact, leaving the surface beneath untouched. "No effect," Webb said. "It's not blocking them, it's digesting them." "Commander!" comms shouted. "Bellwether is breaking formation. Full burn, pushing past safe thermal limits." Voss looked at the tactical map. The alien hull had begun pulsing faster along its bow, and the projected line of its next strike didn't point toward the rogue escort. It pointed straight at the Resolute. "Aldridge, pull back!" She slammed the fleet-wide override. "Captain, abort the burn. That's an order." The radio hissed. Then his voice cut through, flat and terribly calm. "Keep your guns hot, Elena. Make it count." "Don't." She had no breath left to say it out loud. The word died somewhere behind her teeth. A half-second before the alien hull released, the Bellwether's icon crossed into the strike's path. A single pulse of distorted light didn't simply hit the ship. It seemed to unravel the space the ship occupied. The Resolute's dampeners groaned under the backwash. When the glare cleared, the Bellwether was simply gone, and 93 people had bought her 90 seconds with their lives. She would not have time to learn their names. She understood that even as the thought formed, and filed it away with everything else she wasn't allowed to feel yet. "Spectral data's in." Webb's hands flew across a console, smoking faintly at one corner. "That shield's not static. It's resonating. 40 to 42 gigahertz. It's breaking matter down to displace it." "It's not armor." Voss said it slowly, the shape of the idea arriving before the words did. "It's a gate. A gate that has to process whatever hits it." Webb's face had gone pale under the console lighting. "Clean impacts. It eats fine, one at a time. But flood it. more debris than it can chew before the next bite lands. It chokes. "All batteries, chain fire, 0 interval," Voss said into the comms mic. "Every gun onto a single coordinate, the bow weapon mount. Fire!" The order should have killed the guns outright. 3 seconds in, a bank of breakers along the aft bulkhead blew in a shower of sparks, and the bridge lights dropped to half power, throwing half her crew into shadow mid-motion. The air handlers shrieked, straining to keep pace with heat the coils were never built to shed. A thick smell of scorched insulation rolled across the bridge, ozone underneath it sharp enough to taste. "Gun 3's overheating past red line," someone shouted from a side station. 12 seconds to thermal lockout." "Override the lockout," Voss said. "Burn it out if you have to. Keep firing." The deck shuddered hard enough that she had to brace one hand against the console. Somewhere above her, a support strut groaned under stress it had never been built to carry. A second breaker bank failed, and the rear half of the bridge dropped into near darkness, emergency lighting flickering on in a sickly red that did nothing to cut through the haze now gathering near the ceiling. In the smoke, and the dark, and the screaming of metal. For one strange moment, Voss thought of Maya asleep on her shoulder at some family dinner a decade gone, small and warm and entirely unaware that one day a woman who looked nothing like a soldier would grow up wanting the stars badly enough to die reaching for them. She put it away. There would be time, or there wouldn't. On the display, the pulsing shimmer around that single coordinate began to stutter as the volume of fractured slug debris overwhelmed whatever process was meant to consume it. The next salvo passed clean through the gap, as though the alien hull had briefly stopped existing. The strike tore a wound low on the hull. What came pouring out was not gas. It hit the vacuum and seized instantly into a glittering, slow-tumbling cloud of crystalline particulate, dense and iridescent, throwing starlight back in fractured colors that had no business existing outside a furnace. It didn't expand the way a vented atmosphere should. It hung there, heavy and unnatural, as though the ship were bleeding something that froze the moment it touched open space and simply refused to thin. A tremor ran the length of the hull, and this time it was real. The pulse along its bow went dark. "Sustain it," Voss said, raising her voice over alarms now layered 3 deep across the bridge. "Don't let it close." "Gun 3 is gone, Commander. Full burnout." The side station's report came clipped fast. "Guns 1 and 4 are still feeding, but we're pulling reserve power from life support to keep them hot." "Pull it," Voss said. "We breathe stale air or we don't breathe at all." Light flared along the alien hull's length, layered and strange, nothing like a simple engine burn, and for one sickening moment, Voss was certain it would fold itself away entirely, back into whatever had spat it out. Instead, the light sputtered and collapsed. The vast, wounded shape on her screen began to drift, broken, trailing its heavy, glittering cloud of frozen debris into the dark. "Cease fire." The words came out smaller than she meant them to. The guns fell silent, and into that silence rushed everything the fight had buried. The cooling fans, what remained of them, whined down through ragged, uneven cycles. The bridge lights stayed locked at half power, throwing long shadows across consoles, still smoking faintly in 3 places. Behind her, a junior officer was crying quietly and trying very hard to pretend he wasn't, and nobody had the energy left to pretend not to notice. Voss kept both hands flat against the console. She wasn't certain her legs would hold her without it. 3 crew manifests sat open on her display, waiting on her authorization to transmit. 193 names in all. She found Maya's first, because some part of her had been looking for it the whole fight without admitting it, and let herself hold it for exactly 1 breath. A girl who used to fall asleep on her shoulder during family dinners, who had grown up wanting nothing more than to see the stars up close. Then she straightened. The ship was still half dark and bleeding power, and there was no one left above her to give the next order. The wreck did not look smaller up close. That was the first thing that struck Voss when the salvage shuttle finally brought her within a kilometer of the alien hull, 11 hours after the guns went quiet. She had half expected the distance to have inflated it somehow, the way fear inflates things seen in the dark. Instead, It hung before her viewport in all its impossible enormity, a mountain with no peak, trailing that slow, iridescent cloud of frozen crystalline debris from the wound the Resolute had torn in its side. The cloud had not dispersed. It had grown denser, the material continuing to vent and freeze as whatever internal systems still functioned aboard the vessel slowly gave out one by one. It caught the distant sun and scattered it into colors that had no names in any human language Voss knew. She noted this carefully in her log. She noted everything carefully now, because the alternative was to stop moving, and she was not yet ready to find out what happened when she did. The science team, assembled from the Resolute's surviving crew and a hastily redirected research vessel that had been cataloging Kuiper Belt objects 200,000 kilometers away, worked with a focused, quiet urgency that Voss recognized as the professional cousin of terror. They moved along the alien hull in magnetic harnesses, running instruments across its surface, feeding data back to the shuttle in a continuous stream that the Resolute's remaining systems were barely keeping pace with. The hull's surface, seen up close, was not the uniform obsidian it had appeared at range. It was textured in ways that changed depending on the angle of observation, the folds and geometries shifting between what appeared to be structural elements and what appeared to be something else entirely, something that had no analog in any human engineering discipline, and that the lead scientist aboard the shuttle described in her preliminary report only as intentional in a way we cannot yet categorize. The interior, accessed through the breach, was worse. Voss pulled herself through the wound in the hull and understood immediately that the vessel had not been designed around human assumptions about space. There were no corridors in any conventional sense, no defined floor or ceiling, no orientation that suggested its builders had ever needed to anchor themselves to a surface. The internal geometry was radial, every chamber opening onto a central axis from which other chambers branched and rebranched in patterns that suggested less an engineered layout and more the internal structure of something biological. A bone. A hive. Something that had grown into its shape rather than been assembled into it. What they found inside rewrote nearly every assumption the science team had carried through the breach with them. The vessel's navigation system, if that term could be applied to something so fundamentally unlike a navigation system, contained records. Not in any format a human computer could directly parse, but in a format that a physicist named Rahul Mehta, working 20 sleepless hours straight in the shuttle's cramped lab, managed to partially decode by treating the data not as language, but as mathematics. And what the mathematics described, once Mehta had mapped its basic grammar, was not a mission. It was a catalog. The vessel had been here before, not recently, and not alone. The records described a survey pattern, a systematic sweep of the outer solar system conducted across an interval of time that Mehta initially calculated as decades, and then, rerunning his figures 3 times with increasing discomfort, revised to centuries. The alien civilization had been watching humanity's solar system for longer than the steam engine had existed. They had watched, recorded, cataloged, and determined something, some threshold crossed or condition met, that had finally prompted this visit. The vessel was not a warship. It was, by every measure Mehta could extract from the data, a first contact assessment probe. Its purpose had been to approach, evaluate the dominant species' capacity for resistance, and transmit that evaluation home. Voss read Mehta's report in the dim red light of the Resolute's half-powered bridge and felt the cold weight of what it meant settle into her bones like deep space chill. The vessel had transmitted before the battle. The duration and content of that transmission were impossible to determine from the wreck's remaining systems, but the fact of it was not. Something, somewhere out in the dark, now knew that humanity existed, that it had fought back. And how? She filed her own report to Earth with steady hands, and then sat very still for a long moment, looking at the starfield through the viewport, understanding for the first time in her life that she was not looking at emptiness. She was looking at distance. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously. The thing about humanity, the thing that its history demonstrated over and over again to anyone willing to read that history honestly, was that it did not respond to existential threats the way other animals did. Most creatures, when cornered, either fought or fled. Humanity did both simultaneously, and while it was fighting and fleeing, it was also measuring, analyzing, cataloging, arguing about the data, building institutions to argue more efficiently, and somehow, in the space between the terror and the running, finding time to be magnificent. Earth's response to Voss's report took 18 months to fully materialize, and it was the most concentrated expression of human capability in recorded history. The Resolute returned to a solar system that was already unrecognizable. 14 shipyards that had spent decades building commercial haulers and deep survey vessels had been retooled, expanded, and set to work around the clock producing something different. The mining consortiums that had supplied the unstable tungsten isotope had their entire production stock requisitioned and found, to their considerable surprise, that the requisition orders came with manufacturing specifications for a new class of slug that maximized internal stress fracturing under high-velocity impact, engineered specifically to overwhelm an alien displacement gate that nobody at the design bureau had ever personally encountered. They built what the specifications required because the specifications arrived with Voss's battle telemetry appended, and nobody who read that telemetry argued about the urgency. Voss herself was given a choice, which was itself a kind of luxury she had not expected. She could take command of the Defense Coordination Council, working from Earth, shaping the strategy that would determine how humanity met whatever came next, or she could take command of the fleet. She took the fleet because she was the only living human being who had seen the alien ship fire, and because that knowledge lived in her hands and her nerves and the particular way her eyes moved across a tactical display, and she did not trust it to survive the translation into briefing documents and committee discussions intact. The fleet she received bore no resemblance to the 4 mismatched ships she had taken to the edge of the solar system. 31 vessels, each purpose-built, their railgun arrays engineered from the ground, up around the tungsten isotope and the chain fire principle that Webb had derived from the Tarot's dying telemetry. The displacement gate problem, as the engineering teams had taken to calling it, was solved. What was not solved, and what kept Voss awake through more nights than she cared to count, was the problem of the weapon itself, the pulse of distorted light that had unmade the Meridian and the Tarot and the Bellwether, without leaving so much as a debris field behind. Meta, who had followed Voss back from the wreck site and declined 3 separate offers of a university position in order to continue his work, had spent the intervening months building a theoretical model of the weapon based on the terawatt energy readings Webb had captured in those final seconds. His conclusion, delivered in a document dense with mathematics that only a handful of people on Earth could fully parse, was straightforward in its implication, if not its derivation. The weapon did not destroy matter. It displaced it, using the same gate principle as the ship's defensive field, operating at a scale and intensity that essentially translated a target from its location in space to somewhere else, somewhere that Meta's equations described but declined to name in any physical terms that made intuitive sense. The defensive solution Meta proposed was elegant in the way that ideas born from desperation and genius in equal measure tend to be elegant. If the weapon was a gate, it required a defined target to open, and if its targeting mechanism operated on the same resonance frequency as the defensive field, then a sufficiently dense cloud of fractured tungsten isotope deployed between the weapon and its target at the moment of firing would do to the weapon precisely what the chain fire technique had done to the gate. It would clog it, force it to attempt to process and displace a volume of dense, unstable material far beyond its operational capacity at the precise moment it was trying to process something else entirely. It was, Meta noted at the end of his report, the same basic principle as jamming a door with gravel. He apologized for the inelegance of the metaphor. Voss thought it was the most beautiful thing she had read in 18 months. She had her crews training on the deployment system before the ink on Meta's report had finished drying, and when the long-range arrays, now extended well beyond Neptune's orbit, on a network of automated relay stations that hadn't existed the year before, detected the signature of incoming displacement gates 240,000 kilometers out, she was ready in the way that only someone who has survived being unready once can truly be ready. There were 11 of them. 11 vessels dropped into the outer solar system with the same absence of warning that the first had shown, that quality of something that had simply decided to exist where it had not existed before. They were not identical to the first vessel, which had been, as the science teams had speculated, essentially an assessment drone. These were different in proportion and geometry, larger in some dimensions and more complex in others, and they carried themselves with the particular patience of things that had never lost a fight. They arranged themselves in a formation that Voss's tactical team spent 11 minutes analyzing, before concluding it had no analog in any human military doctrine, because it was not a formation designed to fight an opponent the fleet's commanders expected to be able to fight back. It was an extermination pattern. Voss looked at the tactical display for exactly as long as it took her to understand this, and then she gave the first order, and the fleet moved. What followed was not a battle in the way that word tends to be used by people who have not been in one. It was a problem, and Voss worked it the way she worked every problem, from the outside in, finding the edges first, and then the shape, and then the place where the shape was weakest. 11 vessels, each carrying a displacement weapon capable of unmaking a ship in a heartbeat, arranged in a pattern that placed their firing arcs in overlapping coverage of every approach vector her fleet could use. Every approach vector, that is, except the ones that ran directly between them, through the overlapping fields of their own weapons, through the gaps their formation had created, by assuming that nothing willing to fight them would be willing to fly directly into the space between 11 alien ships and dare them to fire. Humanity, Voss had concluded some time ago, had a particular relationship with daring things not to fire. It was not a relationship born of recklessness, it was born of arithmetic, the cold calculation of a species that had spent its entire history weighing terrible options against each other and choosing the least terrible with clear eyes. She split the fleet into 4 groups and sent them into the gaps simultaneously, deploying tungsten clouds ahead of each formation in dense pre-fractured spreads that turned the space between the alien ships into a suspension of unstable material that no displacement weapon could fire through without clogging itself on the debris. The alien formation, designed for an opponent who would approach from outside, had no answer for opponents who were suddenly inside, moving between them with clouds of gravel that made their primary weapons effectively blind. The alien ships were not helpless. They had secondary systems that Voss's fleet had not encountered before, and 3 of her 31 ships were lost in the first 8 minutes of engagement, not unmade the way the early ships had been, but damaged by physical impact systems that appeared to be the alien equivalent of a last resort, which told her something important about how the alien commanders had expected the engagement to proceed. They had expected, she understood, to unmake everything at range and never need the close-quarter systems at all. The fact that humanity was inside their formation, inside their minimum safe firing distance, was an outcome their entire tactical posture had been designed to make impossible. It was not impossible. Humanity was simply willing to pay a price to make it possible that the alien commanders had not factored into their calculations, because no species the aliens had previously encountered had been willing to pay it. The engagement lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, 9 of the 11 alien vessels had been disabled or destroyed, their displacement gates clogged beyond function, their hulls breached by railgun fire that had by now been refined and concentrated into something far more purposeful than the desperate chain fire Voss had improvised over the bellwether's grave. The remaining 2 broke formation and folded away into wherever they came from, and the solar system was, for the moment, quiet. Voss stood at her console in the half-dark of a bridge that smelled of scorched metal and hard work, and looked at the tactical display for a long time. The 2 that had escaped troubled her more than the 9 that hadn't. 3 things happened in the year that followed the second engagement, and each of them changed humanity in ways that the species would spend centuries understanding. The first was Meta's translation. Working with a team that had grown to include linguists, mathematicians, musicians, and at least one architect whose contribution none of the others could fully explain but all agreed was essential, Meta completed his partial decoding of the alien vessel's records and found, buried in the deepest layers of the catalog, something that none of them had thought to look for. A classification system, A taxonomy of species encountered, assessed, and acted upon, stretching back across a span of time that made human civilization look like an afternoon. Hundreds of entries, each corresponding to a world the alien civilization had visited and evaluated according to criteria that Meta's team was only beginning to understand. Every entry in the catalog ended the same way, with a notation that Meta translated, after 6 weeks of careful work, as something between the concepts of concluded and resolved. Every entry, that is, except the most recent one. The entry corresponding to a small, unremarkable planet orbiting an average star in an undistinguished arm of the galaxy, whose dominant species had apparently done something in the outer reaches of its solar system that the catalog's notation system had no existing category for. The entry was marked, in the alien taxonomy, with a symbol that appeared nowhere else in the entire record. Meta spent 2 weeks attempting to translate it before concluding that the closest human concept was not a word but a posture, the particular stillness of something very old and very confident that has just, for the first time, encountered a reason to be careful. The second thing that happened was the signal. It arrived not as a weapon but as a transmission, in a format that suggested deliberate construction rather than automated broadcast, directed precisely at the coordinates where the Resolute had been stationed during the first engagement. Someone had been watching that battle, had noted the position of the surviving ship, and had waited a full year before sending. The content of the transmission was dense and took 8 months to partially decode, but its basic structure, once understood, was unmistakable. It was not a threat. It was not an apology. It was the opening move of something that no word in any human language quite captured, because humanity had never been in this particular position before, the position of a species that something larger and older and more powerful had decided was worth talking to rather than resolving. The catalog, it turned out, had a first page, and humanity had just been written onto it in a category of its own. The third thing that happened was quieter than the other two, and in the long accounting of history, it mattered more than either of them. Voss retired from Fleet Command on a cool morning in Geneva, surrounded by people who had prepared speeches, and found, when the moment arrived, that the speeches felt insufficient. She had spent the intervening year doing what commanders do after the immediate emergency passes, writing reports, attending councils, translating the raw, terrible knowledge she carried into protocols and training programs and tactical doctrines that would outlast her. She had read every name on the 3 manifests she had transmitted from the Resolute's bridge, and attended every memorial she had been physically capable of attending, and spoken to families when they wanted to be spoken to and given them silence when they didn't. She left Geneva on a transport heading for a small observatory in the mountains, where an old friend had offered her a quiet room and access to a telescope and no obligations whatsoever for as long as she wanted them. On the night she arrived, she climbed to the telescope platform and looked out at the sky for a long time without using any instrument at all. The stars were the same stars she had looked at her entire life, unchanged by everything that had happened beneath them. Orion still stood at his old angle. The Milky Way still arched overhead in its patient, indifferent splendor, full of 100 billion stars and whatever moved between them in the dark. But she did not look at the sky the way she had looked at it before, the way everyone had looked at it before, as a beautiful and empty ceiling above a world that stood alone. She looked at it the way you look at a room full of strangers after you have learned that at least one of them knows your name. Not afraid, not comfortable either. Simply present and awake, and aware of what awareness cost. Somewhere out in that vast and ancient dark, something had looked back at humanity and written in its catalog a symbol it had never written before, in a record that stretched back further than humanity had known how to count. And somewhere closer, in a room she had not yet been able to bring herself to visit, a family was still learning to keep living in a world where a girl who had wanted nothing more than to see the stars up close had finally gotten exactly what she'd wanted and had not come back. Voss stayed on the platform until the cold drove her inside, and then a little longer after that. The stars did not move. They never did. They simply burned, patient and distant, illuminating everything they touched and explaining nothing, the way they had always done, the way they would continue to do long after every question humanity had thought to ask them had finally been answered or forgotten. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the window and watched the light change, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of creature that looked up and asked, and kept asking, even when the answer came back in the form of something enormous and armed and deeply certain. It had nothing to learn from anything as small and brief and stubborn as a human being. It meant, she decided, something she was not yet ready to put into words. She had time to find them. That was the whole point. That was what 3 ships had bought, at a price she would carry in her chest like a stone for the rest of her life. She had time.